Hi, everybody. I just wanted to get on here and talk about lesson planning. First of all, my name is Amber Noto. I am in my third year in public education, and I have to say, even that after 3 years of working in public education, the one thing as a future educator that scares me the most is lesson planning. It can be really, really overwhelming for a first-year teacher or even just anyone in general who is not familiar with it. So hopefully after this video, we both feel a little bit more comfortable with one of the probably lesser fun parts of being a teacher. So I have to say, starting out, the most important thing would have to be knowing your students. There are several pieces to this, but knowing your students is going to help you lesson plan. It's going to help you with classroom management. It's going to help you form those relationships to get your students to learn in a constructive environment, a less stressful environment for you, and just a happier classroom all around. So first of all, you're going to want to know the number of students that you're going to have, obviously. That way you can have your classroom set up, but you're really, really, really going to want to know your students' learning abilities. This is probably the most important thing for you as an educator, is to really, really know your students, know where they are in their learning, know if they have accommodations, do they have disabilities, are they just a general education student, are they GT to where they're going to be a little bit bored with regular lessons and they're going to want to be challenged a little bit more. These are all things that you're going to want to know prior to, planning your first lesson. So if you're not familiar, students can either be labeled, if we really want to call it that, as special education or 504. They can be general education students, like I said. They can be gifted and talented. It just depends. So special education, most students, or a lot of students that fall into this category, do need modifications to the curriculum. So that could mean, homework with less questions than the other students in the class. Maybe they need shorter tests, or maybe they need more time on their test. It just depends. There's a lot of different modifications to the curriculum that students may or may not need. They may need verbal reading for testing. And so that ties in kind of to the other side too. So students that are 504, it's a huge, huge, huge umbrella of things that could fall under this category. They could have just a medical condition to where maybe they get headaches in class, or maybe they have had some sort of medical problem, in the past that kind of makes them struggle a little bit. They could be visually impaired. They could have ADHD, whether that be minor or major. And so these students will need accommodations as far as, classroom environment. Do you have students who will need maybe a 5-minute break in between lessons to kind of cool off or burn off some energy, so that they can focus? Do you have students who maybe have some anger problems, and so they need a little bit of a timeout with an aide or maybe with another teacher in order to keep that learning going? This is going to really, really, really help you with your lesson planning. It's going to help you with classroom management. You have to know your kids. You have to know where they're at, and you have to meet them at their level. Another thing, just in my experience, because, I do work in a Title I district, so we do have some kids that have come from some different backgrounds to where maybe things at home aren't as great. And so a lot of that stuff does filter into the classroom. So you really, really need to know the community that your students live in. You need to be able to relate to them, and meet them where they're at. Even if you don't have experiences that are similar to theirs, educate yourself on things that they may be going through so that you can kind of see signs, if they're struggling or anything like that. This will help you to be able to reach them in a much better way, and it will definitely help you with forming relationships with those kids that are going to be vital for classroom management and lesson planning. So the next thing I'll move on to is you're going to need to know your learning community. So that kind of ties into what I said before, but this is, a little bit too of how you're going to set your classroom up. Is it going to be conducive to the lessons that you're planning? If you set your classroom up, say your desks are faced all in a circle, but then you want something, you want to do a lesson where the kids have to move around certain places, you have to be prepared for that kind of stuff. So anyways, what is a community setting of your school? What resources do you have on your campus that will help you with your lessons? That'll kind of bring me into materials and resources that are needed. So you're going to want to know, for the 8 days of lesson planning, or however, long your lesson planning in advance, what materials you're going to need. You may need to request materials from your administrator. You may need to ask your campus secretary for, spirals if you're going to do journals, or, it just depends. There could be a wide variety of things. One thing that I can uh, uh, think of off the top of my head, are markers. Okay, not every teacher has a set of markers for every kid, so maybe they have to go to their campus secretary and get that. So you really, really need to know your materials ahead of time. Another thing is you need to know potential safety issues. So you need to know, is there something in your lesson that could potentially harm your students? Do you have the materials needed to protect them, like eye goggles, or maybe you need some helping hands in your classroom for that lesson. Maybe you need an aid in there or something like that. So knowing those precautions ahead of time and really being prepared can help to avoid crisis in your classroom. So the biggest part of testing, not testing, the biggest part of lesson planning, which goes into testing, is going to be TEKS. This stands for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. These are the guidelines that are set by the state of Texas for educators in curriculum. So basically, throughout the year, there's going to be goals and objectives that your students need to meet in order to be in compliance with what your state requires of you. The good thing is that the teachers do have a little bit of freedom as far as how they meet those goals. So you can pick lessons, depending on your teaching style and your kids' learning style, but you do have to go by those TEKS and meet those goals as they come. And so you really, really want to be prepared and be knowledgeable of your TEKS. That way, when you're doing your lessons, you're not going outside the scope of what's required of you from the state. So that kind of ties into the next thing, which is instructional objective. What are the goals of your lesson? Where do you want your students to be at the end of you teaching this lesson? How far do you want them to have progressed when you're finished? So a good way to start that is to do an anticipatory set. It's kind of a hard word to say, but how are you going to lay the foundation for your lesson? So basically, a good thing to do would maybe do an assessment at the beginning and just kind of see where your students are before you even teach anything. Let's say you have a gifted and talented class, and they're going to be a lot more. They're going to want to be challenged more than maybe some of your students who are on some lower learning levels. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you just kind of need to know that before you start. So maybe you do a verbal assessment, just kind of a quiz them in class, or maybe you do actually a written assessment to where you can look at the scores and look at each individual student and see where they are. So moving on to the next thing would be your input or procedures or your instruction and modeling. Are your expectations of the lesson clear? Is it clear to your students what you're going to be learning, what expectations you have of them, how far into the lesson y'all are going to go, and everything like that. What are the steps that you're going to take and the students are going to take to reach the goals at the end of that lesson, and kind of make it a community thing where, I have to reach this goal, so I need you to reach this goal with me. How are we going to do this together? So another thing, so modeling or guided practice, independent practice, these are all things that can tie into this. If you're modeling something, if you're going to demonstrate to the students what you're teaching them, does it demonstrate to them in a good way? Does it really show them what you're trying to get across? Or are you going to do guided practice? Do you want to have the students kind of try their best to complete something with you guiding them just a little bit and kind of seeing how much they can do it themselves? This is a good way to kind of assess them also. Another thing is independent practice. So once you've kind of done the modeling, you've done it yourself, then they've done it a little bit with you helping them, then you want to do independent practice. This is where the students are just on their own. They're doing a part of the lesson, or maybe a section of the lesson, or an assignment that goes with it, and they're doing it completely alone. Where are they while they're doing that? Are they struggling a lot? Do they seem to need more help? have they mastered it to where you don't even have to reteach that? So that's a good thing for you to kind of know where they are. So this kind of ties into assessments. So once you've taught your lesson, you're good to go. You really want to test your students and figure out where they are. Do you have students that have totally mastered it? Do you have one or two students that are super behind the rest of your class? Is it the majority of your class that's struggling with a certain section? This is really, really going to help you to see where they're at, assess their abilities and everything, and then that's going to really tie you into the next section, which is reteaching. So once you've assessed your kids, you know where they are, you know where their struggles are, this will help you to plan out the rest of everything to where you know exactly what you need to go over again, and how you're going to do that. Do you have to teach it as a whole class situation? Do you kind of set your class up to where you can pull small groups and just work with those one or two kids that are struggling? So you have to do those assessments and you have to reteach those sections. That way you know that you're meeting your goals and your objectives all together as a class. So once you've done your assessments, this brings us to the end of the lesson. One thing is you kind of want to touch on enrichment at the end. So, do your students really, really know the material? Have they mastered it? Can they kind of, they know everything about this lesson, maybe not everything, but they know enough that you've met your goals, you've met your objectives, you feel confident that they will test well over it. And can they, move on to the next part of it and confidently be okay with leaving that part back and moving on to the next thing? And so that kind of brings us to closure. So you want to really close out the lesson with something strong that really just instills that confidence in your students that they know the material, they're good to go, and this is really going to help when it comes time for testing. The more confident that your students are in their learning, the better they're going to perform, and the better that they're going to feel, and the better you're going to feel as an educator. So I hope that this has helped you. It has certainly helped me to be more familiar with the different parts of lesson planning. I know that it can be a little bit overwhelming, but I really wish you luck in your future lesson planning, and have a good day.